Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. We're going to honor those who are on time by giving Mr. Yadon
A prize?
a free book for being on time. Thank you for being here. I have the privilege of introducing Mr. Yadon. Chris is a friend of mine and also a professional associate. I'll read his bio here and then just mention a few other things about him before we turn the microphone over to him. Chris is the executive director of the Younique Foundation, which is a nonprofit that inspires hope in women who were sexually abused as children or adolescents by hosting them at a retreat where they are uplifted by each other and learn skills that can help them find individual healing. Chris also oversees Defend Innocence, which is a brand dedicated to educating and empowering parents on how to protect their children from sexual abuse. Defend Innocence also leads the public dialogue to bring the epidemic of abuse to light. Chris has been privileged to speak hundreds of times to audiences that range from under 50 to several thousand. His passion is to educate parents on how they can protect their children from sexual abuse and teach them healthy sexuality. So that's his bio. You've read that already. I want to share with you also. Oh, we're going longer. No. We have 15 more minutes.
We've got 15 more minutes. Starts at 4:45, right? Is that what the schedule says?
I think it's 3:30. 3:30.
Oh, 3:30.
Yeah, it does.
Okay, that's all right. It was a good timing because I'm shifting from the written bio to the real bio. Chris and his wife Christy are parents of 6 children. They live in Lehigh. Their children are from 18 months to 18 years old. Chris most recently worked for the church in their IT department. That was his dream job, and he planned to be there for the rest of his life until he was moved to come, inspired to come and be involved in teaching families about healthy sexuality and about how to protect themselves and their children. And he'll share a little bit about why that. But the other thing about Chris is he is someone who is grounded in gospel song. And I say that because I know him. I've had no less than a half dozen experiences listening to him speak, lead, teach. He was called at age 31 to be a stake president. He just finished that 9-year term. Yeah, that's right.
Thank you.
He told me, he said today, he said, Grant, I actually have time to read books now. And but prior to his working for the church, he had run a number of successful tech startup companies. And so his life is really not about earning money right now. It's about giving back. And this topic of avoiding and overcoming some of these addictive behaviors that can lead to just terrible things that break families and cause so much pain has been a mission of his for quite some time. And so what I also want to just do by way of introduction here is mention to you what this is not. And this is one of the reasons why I chose to give this introduction, not just because Chris is a friend. In the spirit of full disclosure, I am also a member of the Younique Foundation. I'm on the board of trustees or the board of governors of this foundation. It's a nonprofit organization. And it's important that you understand what this presentation is not. This presentation is not comprehensive sexuality education trying to be snuck into schools. So any of you that are politically aware of some of these kinds of efforts, that's not what this is. This is also not Keynesian philosophy, a philosophy of liberalizing the conversation around sexuality so that we can liberalize sex in our society. That's not what this is. There are many of these kinds of covert, very sly kinds of methods to hurt our children, but that's not what this is. What this is just what the title is. Teaching parents how to talk to children about sexuality before the world does. You received a handout from A Parent's Guide, which is one of the most wonderful, revelation-inspired and science-inspired documents that the church puts on its website for parents to talk to their children from ages 0 through teenage years. Chris will make reference to that, but we just wanted to make sure that you were all comfortable with what this is not, and again, who Chris is, so that you trust what's about to be said. I trust Chris. I trust him implicitly. And so without further ado, let's give him a big round of applause, Chris Yadon.
Thanks. Thanks, Grant. I'm going to try to put the mic down. You in the back. Let me know if it works. I prefer to speak loudly.
If you can hold it, we're recording.
I've got my recording here.
Oh, you got it on.
Yep. Is that okay?
I'd recommend you use it.
All right. I'll use it.
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to catch these front lights to help with the slide. First of all, I'm extremely grateful to be here to present. And based on that bio, you might ask, why is the tech guy talking about this topic? Why was he asked to lead a nonprofit foundation that focuses on clinical healing of those that have been through sexual abuse and educating? Let me share a little bit more of my backstory. So there are many touch points that I have with American Heritage that are very, very important to me. I'm going to start with a story about my son. But I need to back up before I tell you about my son and tell you about an experience I had in this auditorium that we were just in. And I was listening to the Ayers. Did you hear the little part when the Ayers were talking where he suggested that you might talk to your children about sex at age 8? He gave that exact same line a little over 10 years ago when I was sitting there in that auditorium. And my oldest, who's now 18, was 8. And I was floored. I was like, you've got to be kidding me. There is no way he's ready. There's no way I'm ready. Coming from background, neither Christy or I, Christy, my wife, grew up in homes where sexuality was discussed. In fact, in some ways, it was presented negatively in both of our homes. That's not to speak negatively of our parents. We both have amazing parents. But it was part of the generation that we grew up in. It was just the reality of it. So here I am sitting here listening to the Ayers say that, and I'm like, no way. I had recently, as Grant mentioned, I'd recently been called as a stake president about the same time. And I had a stake conference with Elder Fraser Bullock, who sits on the board of American Heritage, by the way. And he was the presiding authority. And he pulled the three of us aside, and he said, you must become experts in the topic of combating pornography. This was shortly after I had that experience with the Ayers. We took it to heart, and we formed committees. We ourselves started spending many, many hours. And after pouring through thousands and thousands of hours of information, we came up with a strategy for our stake on how to combat pornography. And the number one thing that we felt was essential to effectively combat pornography was to help instill in our children a healthy perspective of sexuality. It is the number one, from our research, the number one thing that we felt like could be done to help combat pornography, but more importantly, to help our children know how to respond when they were exposed to it. Because in the age we live in, exposure is not if, it's when. And so how does the child respond? And so we put together comprehensive work around teaching healthy sexuality. That's where my passion for this topic was born. So it had nothing to do with my career at the time. Call me an amateur expert if you want to call it that at the time. And then when I was called by the Maxfields, who started the Younique Foundation, to come and lead the Younique Foundation, which focuses on the topic of sexual abuse, I immediately made the same connection that the number one thing we can do to protect our children from sexual abuse, and there's many things we can do, but the number one thing we can do is help develop healthy sexuality in our children. So that's my background on the topic, and now I do it full time, and it's a wonderful thing to be a part of. So back to my son, right? Here we are. Christy and I have a little talk, and we're like, yeah, I guess we better talk about it. I had had the talk from Elder Bullock, got exposed to all this information that the average age of exposure for boys to pornography is between 9 and 11. All of a sudden it clicked. Oh, I see now why the Ayers were recommending to talk about it at age 8. They want me to get to it as a parent before the world gets to my children. So we said, okay, we're going to do it. And I totally flubbed it. So let me tell you how it went. So we thought, okay, we're going to go do a father-son activity. We're going to drive down to a basketball game. We're going to have the big talk on the way to the basketball game. Being over-exuberant parents with our oldest son, you can imagine an 8-year-old in his booster seat, in the back seat, driving down to the Marriott Center in this case. And Dad's spilling it, saying, son, this is how it works. I had read a parent's guide from the church. You know, it kind of gave some examples of how to talk about it. Did my best to follow that. And he was dead silent the whole time. And after me going through all of this, I said, son, do you want to ask any questions? And he said, yeah, Dad, I have one. And I was excited. I'm like, this is going well. And his one question was, can we talk about something else? Fortunately, things went better with him later. But let me compare this with my daughter. Okay, so she was 6 at this time. And so Christy and I thought, well, there's probably some appropriate conversations we can have with her. Maybe we won't have the big talk with her at 6. That might be a little early. But there's probably some appropriate things we can talk about that will help prepare her for that big talk, if you will. So we started having those discussions, talking about body safety, talking about the importance of respecting boundaries, all those things you can talk about with those younger ages. And she received it really well. And I remember very vividly, we're sitting on the edge of our bed. She's 8 at this time. We haven't yet had the big talk with her. And she initiated the big talk. She just started asking questions, and Christy and I made eye contact. I can remember very vividly where we were, and we kind of like, yep, here we go. And we went into the discussion about the big talk. And she grilled us for about 30 minutes. Right? She just grilled us with question after question. She was extremely comfortable, in a good way, with the discussion. There wasn't the awkwardness that we had with me and my son. What was the difference? The difference is, as parents, we learned, at least we were starting to learn, that there are ways that we can talk to our kids about healthy sexuality that will help them have a proper perspective. Her perspective was good. It was healthy. She didn't feel ashamed of the topic. She didn't feel uncomfortable with the topic. Probably what made the biggest difference, though, is Christy and I had some practice at that point, and therefore we didn't feel ashamed of the topic, which is sometimes the biggest part of the problem, especially if you grew up in homes like ours where it was a taboo topic. You might be like we were, and that is we were dealing with our own uncomfortable feelings about the whole topic of sex and sexuality. So what I want to do is I want to take just a moment to break, and I want to introduce the organization that I represent. And I'm going to do that with a video. And I'm going to tell you why an organization that focuses on sexual abuse prevention is so interested in the topic as well of teaching healthy sexuality. But just for a moment, watch this video. So the mission of defendinnocence.org is to do two things. First, to educate parents and caregivers how to reduce the risk of sexual abuse. Second, to lead the public dialogue about the prevalence and prevention and need for prevention of abuse. Unfortunately, in our culture, it's very much a taboo topic still. So what does this have to do with teaching healthy sexuality? As I mentioned in the introduction, we believe that teaching healthy sexuality is one of the biggest deterrents to sexual abuse. Giving your children words to describe what's happening in their lives, open communication, and several other things that I'll go through in just a moment. We're a brand that's owned by the Younique Foundation. The Younique Foundation has another arm, which is to help adult women who were sexually abused as children receive healing. So we get to see both sides of it. And many of today's ills, many of the ills described in several of the other presentations, are founded in childhood trauma, with sexual abuse being a significant one of them. I won't go into great detail, but for those that love studies, go check out the ACE study, ACE, Adverse Childhood Experiences, that the CDC and Kaiser did, where they tied corollaries between early childhood trauma and later life health, both mental and physical issues. And the corollaries are very, very strong, with sexual abuse being a huge one. There was one study done by the Department of Justice that suggests 68% of incarcerated women were sexually abused as children. And if we want to fix the ills of the world, like incarceration, like crime, if that is that big of a contributor, we need to go back to the source of the issue, and that's that early childhood trauma. And there's many reasons for that, which we go into in other presentations, unfortunately we can't cover today, of how trauma impacts the brain. And we're so blessed, the last 15 years in particular, with the amount of advancement that brain science has done that's helping us with topics like pornography, helping us with topics like abuse, is so helpful. It's helping us learn so much. So even as I stand before you today, it's hard to say there are any experts in the topic of healthy sexuality, because we're still learning so much about the topic. So let me define what healthy sexuality is so that we're working off the same understanding. Healthy sexuality is more than sexual behavior. Outside influences, particularly media, often only focus on the act of sex itself. And everything they talk about is about the act. Sexuality is much broader than the act. I don't want you to get this confused with what Grant described earlier, is there are some undermining forces that use that concept to say, since sexuality is broader than the sex act, that children experience sexual drives. That's not the case. Children's sexual drives are dormant. However, they are sexual beings. For example, when a child is born, there's an amazing release of oxytocin that in both the child and the mother, the birthing mother, that causes, it's called the cuddle chemical, that causes bonding. It's very, very powerful. That same chemical is released in healthy sexual relationships to cause bonding between the man and the woman. They serve a similar purpose. So developing a child's healthy sexuality starts as early as birth. But then some people that will coerce or try to pervert those realities will take that and say, well, it's okay that a 3-year-old experiences sexual desires and you should let him masturbate. That's not true. But it's important to recognize that it's progressive, and even though the sexual drive, as we know it as adults, is dormant until puberty, it can be awakened prematurely. And the biggest problem for awakening sexual drives prematurely is sexual abuse. In fact, that's what drives, if you've ever heard that there's a lot of shame associated with abuse, the reason why a survivor feels so much shame is because it may have felt physically good to them because their sexual drive was awakened, but they know that it wasn't a good thing. So they have this dissonance, this conflict between what they know to be good and right and what they felt. And that's what causes a lot of sexual shame in survivors of sexual abuse. They're like, why did it feel good? It wasn't good. It wasn't right. It wasn't fair. I didn't ask for it. And they blame themselves, and it causes all sorts of pain. And then they internalize and they stay silent, which makes it even that much worse. And then their families put it under the rug, which makes it that much worse. So understand that sexuality is our entire human experience. It's fundamental. It includes things like communication around our boundaries and our bodies. It includes things like body image and our self-image or self-esteem. It obviously includes the physical expressions that we often associate with sexuality, but also includes socialization, understanding our gender, understanding the role of gender. So one thing that I want to shift to is the ability that you have as parents to have a great influence on your child's life and their development of their sexuality. It's really, really important for us, those who believe in the gospel of Jesus Christ, to communicate our beliefs and viewpoints around sexuality. Don't stay silent on the topic. We do need to promote and respect others' views, because our children need to learn to live in the world and influence those that have different views than we may have in the gospel. But we absolutely need to promote our beliefs, and we need to promote our viewpoints. We need to help our children develop their own understanding of their sexuality. We need to provide doctrinally accurate information and open those lines of communication. Here's a couple of my favorite quotes from leaders of the church. This one, actually not from a leader specifically, but from a parent's guide, which you guys got a handout of a portion of the parent's guide, says, one of the most important concepts that the Lord expects you to teach your children is the righteous meaning and use of intimate physical relations between a man and a woman. This guide was prepared to help you teach your children about these physical intimacies and to prepare them to follow the Lord's plan in expressing their own intimacy. I want to strongly recommend, when you're wondering, well, as a homeschool parent, what's my curriculum? The Parent's Guide, or A Parent's Guide, is an excellent resource for you. An excellent resource.
I just wanted to add, you can get, like, if you have the LDS scriptures.
Yep, it's right there.
Right on your phone.
Yeah, it was done in 1985, and the church didn't address some things that are relevant today. For example, it doesn't address homosexuality very much, but the church has released a lot of other information that you can use as resources. Here's one from President Kimball. In the context of lawful marriage, the intimacy of sexual relations is right and divinely approved. There is nothing unholy or degrading about sexuality in itself. For by that means men and women join in a process of creation and in an expression of love. Those 2 points, the process of creation and the expression of love, are re-emphasized for the strength of the youth. It's really important that we teach both as part of healthy sexuality. Both are very, very important. One of my favorites, and a recent one, came from President Packer. It's probably one of the most impactful quotes from the brethren on this topic. This was given in April. It was his last general conference talk. He said, the power of procreation is not an incidental part of the plan. It is the plan of happiness. It is the key to happiness. And that's based on our belief of eternal increase. Procreation is, I'm not going to purport or suggest that it's the same in the afterlife as it is here. I don't know. It may be, it may not be. But the concept of procreation is an eternal principle. And the method of procreation we've been blessed with here on this life, in this life, needs to be treated with that level of respect and understanding. If it is this important, we as parents need to understand it needs to be part of our curriculum, homeschool or not, in teaching our children. It is our responsibility. That's why there's a lot of organizations that do similar things to what we do, but they may try to teach children. The reason why we don't teach children, the reason why our mission is to educate parents and caregivers, is because we believe this is best taught in the home. That doesn't mean that there aren't some children that don't have that opportunity, and we're apolitical, and we're not going to get into whether it's right or wrong, or we're not going to get into that. But what we are going to get into is our belief that parents are the best ones to teach healthy sexuality. And so that puts a responsibility on us as parents. So I'm going to spend some time on the topic of sexual abuse because that's an important part of healthy sexuality. Because what I mentioned earlier, if sexuality is awakened in your child because of abuse prematurely, it has devastating consequences. So if we can do more to prevent it, then that's a huge safeguard in helping keep our kids healthy and defending their innocence. Then we'll go into some of the specifics of teaching sexuality. So I'm going to first hit on some myths that are really important to debunk. We'll talk about grooming patterns, how to recognize them. We'll talk about factors that increase risk that are pretty normal in different children's lives, so that if your children have any of these factors, you know that they may be at greater risk. We'll talk about the tools that you have to minimize the risk. We'll talk about age-appropriate conversations. I want to say just a note on this one. We leave on our notes that are in your binder, we leave this section blank. You'll notice everywhere else we put our little tips. The reason why we leave this blank is we feel that a parent's discernment is really, really important. So although we'll give you recommendations for ages similar to what the Ayers did, please understand our perspective is that those are recommendations for you to consider. Don't take them as have-tos. Don't take them as absolutes. You need to discern. You need to seek promptings for when it's appropriate to address different topics and different ages. We'll talk about how can we address unhealthy behaviors if our children are engaged in some unhealthy sexual behaviors. And then we'll talk about long-term benefits, and then I'm going to ask you to join us in being a defender, and I'll talk about what that means. I don't believe we'll have time today for Q&A, but I'm staying through dinner, so I'll take as many questions as you have through the evening, and you're always welcome to reach out to us at the foundation. So let's go through our myths. Myth number 1, sexual abuse always includes physical contact. The truth is sexual abuse also includes non-physical contact, such as purposeful exposure to pornography. If an older child or an adult purposefully exposes children to pornography, that would be an example of abuse. Sexual innuendo, especially if it's excessive in your home or in another environment. Voyeurism, where someone may expose themselves to your child but not touch your child, is also considered abuse. Basically, anytime an adult or a peer, particularly an older peer, forces or coerces a child into sexual activity, it is considered childhood sexual abuse from a clinical standpoint. Understand that's not the same as the legal standpoint. But in terms of the impact it can have on their health, from a clinical perspective, if there's force or coercion, then that constitutes abuse. Myth number 2, sexual abuse only happens to girls. The truth is sexual abuse occurs to both boys and girls, and approximately 300,000 children in the U.S. are abused each year. The specific stats, and these are vetted across a lot of different studies. Let me back up and say, I'm going to share a lot of studies and stats with you, and if you want our references, there's an email in our handout. You can send it. We'll send you a reference sheet. Understand my perspective on stats. You can find a stat to validate almost anything that you want to say. So when we look for stats, we try hard to find stats that are across a lot of different studies with a lot of different biases, so that hopefully we're getting more accurate information. So the most consistent information is that 1 in 4 girls will be sexually abused before age 18. 1 in 6 boys will be sexually abused before age 18. So this is not an issue just for girls. So why don't you hear about it more? It's because it is driven into secrecy. It's swept under the rug, which I'll talk about in a minute. Myth number 3, abusers are usually strangers, the whole stranger danger concept. As important as it is to teach stranger danger, please understand that perpetrators are usually people that we know and interact with on a regular basis. It's believed that between 80 and 90. The majority of studies say 90, but 90% of children know their abuser. Danger isn't always a stranger. So don't stop teaching stranger danger, but don't only teach stranger danger. This next stat I'll share with you is fairly broad across different studies, so take it for what it's worth. But it's believed that 60% of those abused are abused by a trusted friend and 30% by a family member. That makes up that 90. So it's in that family trust circle. And this will come into play later in our tools to minimize risk. It's very, very important to understand this statistic. Myth number 4, sexual abuse occurs in odd places like cars or dark alleys. We often think that because we hear about the most extreme cases, the kidnappings, things like that the media will push. The reality is sexual abuse occurs anywhere children are. It happens in homes, it happens in schools, happens in community centers, it happens in churches, including our church. It happens on social media. And it happens anywhere children gather. One interesting statistic about our teens specifically is that 31% of sexual assaults against teens happens in their own home. 31 happens in their own home of sexual assaults against teens. Could be from a boyfriend, date rape type thing, or girlfriend. Could be from a parent or a family member, but it's a high number. Myth number 5, sexual abuse is frequently reported to proper authorities. This is why you don't hear about it. The truth is sexual abuse is rarely reported to authorities. Even worse, families, often protecting the family name or protecting a friend or someone that is in their trust circle, they sweep it under the rug, which causes additional damage. In fact, in our therapy side of our practice, we have to do far more work helping them regain trust because they feel like they couldn't trust their mom, who should have been their protector, because she wouldn't disclose. She wouldn't get her daughter help. She actually carries more animosity towards mom than she does against maybe dad, who was the abuser, because she was supposed to be the one that protected her. So sweeping it under the rug is extremely damaging to the survivor and can cause some pretty lifelong challenges that they would have to face. Fewer than 12% of cases are actually reported to authorities, just to kind of give you a sense of how few actually get reported. Myth number 6, human trafficking doesn't happen in my community. The truth is trafficking happens in every community, in every economic circumstance. In fact, here are 3 examples in the last couple of years from right here in our own backyard. Trafficking happens everywhere. Myth number 7, survivors are going to become abusers themselves. The statistic is too high, but the truth is children can return to healthy living, and if the child gets help, the likelihood of them becoming a perpetrator is extremely low. If they don't get help, the statistic is 30% of survivors will perpetrate if they don't get help. Way too high. Way too high. Which just perpetuates the cycle. Myth number 8, sexual abuse will happen and I can't do anything about it. It's an epidemic, it's a problem. We're over-sexualized in this world, it's just going to happen. The truth is educated parents and caregivers can significantly reduce the likelihood that their children will be abused, and that's exactly why we're here today, and I'll share the specific things you can do that mitigate that risk. So I've started to emphasize this already, but I just want to really, really focus that the importance of understanding that protection against sexual abuse is a parental responsibility, not a child responsibility. Yes, we should educate him. Yes, we should tell him to say no. We should teach him how to avoid situations where they could potentially be at risk. But let me ask you this. What 6-year-old of yours is not going to trust somebody that you bring into the family trust circle? It is not reasonable for us as adults to think that a child can discern danger when we've invited that person into our trust circle. This is why we as parents need to feel the weight of the responsibility on our shoulders. We can't just teach our kids a few things and wipe our hands of the topic. We need to be vigilant. So let's talk about perpetrator patterns. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly, but this is really important part of understanding your responsibility as a parent. The more you recognize how perpetrators operate, the better you are at seeing flags that might be raised. So let's start with who offenders are and what are their and then we'll go on to what their tactics are. So offenders look and act like everyday people. They're often very charismatic. They're community pillars in many cases. They can be in positions of trust like coaches. They could be teachers, church leaders. They work hard to earn trust and they work hard to maintain appearance. So the picture of the creepy guy that you see on the news that perpetrated is not your typical perpetrator. They're often very, very, very looked at very well in the community. So here are grooming patterns that we're about to go through, but understand as we go through these grooming patterns that they have some commonalities. They're very methodical, they're subtle, they're gradual, and they escalate. So the first one is that perpetrators will work hard to form relationships with children. They'll spend a lot of their spare time with children rather than adults. They may be more interested in children than adults. They're quick to offer one-on-one care. They love to give attention to the child, and they do that by things like taking excessive photographs or being infatuated with the child's look and dress, so they might really compliment them a lot. They'll single out a child as a special child, and they can be overly generous in their gift giving, particularly if they've singled out that child. And they'll focus more on being the child's friend than being an adult figure in their life. They'll test boundaries. They'll do this through things like jokes, off-color jokes, roughhousing. They'll do things like touch, so maybe an inappropriate back rub, for example, or taking tickling to an inappropriate level. They, especially with teens, they may use sexualized games like pantsing, strip poker, truth or dare to try to desensitize the child. They'll also test boundaries of children's privacy. They may walk into them in the bathroom to see how the child responds to that, or walk into their bedroom to see how the child responds to that. Definitely with our youth, it's very common that they'll test the youth's willingness to break rules, so around drugs and alcohol, and they use that as blackmail material, which I'll talk about in just a minute. Touch. So touch, definitely they escalate touch. So they'll almost always start with non-sexual touch, even what we would consider appropriate forms of touching. Then they'll usually accidentally touch them in a private area. See how the child responds. They'll use healthy things like hugging, but maybe they'll make that hug longer and add a back rub to it, just something that's not quite normal. Or kissing, a kiss that's longer than is appropriate considering their relationship. Sitting on laps, they'll use things like that. So they'll see how the child responds to those type of touches before they'll perpetrate. They'll intimidate. This is where that blackmail comes in. So they'll use fear, embarrassment, or guilt to keep the youth from telling. So this is where if you tell, I'm going to hurt, and then fill in the blank. Or if you tell, no one's going to believe you. Or if you tell, everybody's going to think you're dirty. This is where the guilting and shaming and blackmail comes in. They'll blame the offender and say, this is your fault. It's your fault that you let this happen, which adds to the shame of the survivor. They'll test that youth's response to being blamed in other things that may not necessarily have to do with sexual abuse. They'll threaten, as I mentioned, and they almost always threaten to maintain secrecy, because perpetrators thrive in secrecy. If they can keep it secret, they can continue to perpetrate. In fact, perpetrators will almost always move on if they believe that secrecy will not be kept. So they'll share sexual material to normalize sexual behavior. So they could be pictures, videos. Maybe they'll do sexting, so they'll do inappropriate texts. They'll use sexual terms freely in the presence of the child. Just again, all about desensitizing that child to make sexual behavior normal to them. As I mentioned earlier, they'll communicate secretly, so they're almost always going to test secret keeping. Perfect example of this happened in Park City a couple months ago. You may have seen it on the news. The band teacher has been using email for years as the primer for perpetration. So he was always desensitizing through email. So using email, text, calling as methods to communicate secretly is very, very common. So as I share this, I have a little bit of a concern or worry. Is you're going to hear these things and you're going to think about people in your neighborhood, people at church, people everywhere, and you're going to go, oh, that's them. Yep, that's them. Right there. There's a perpetrator, right? The reason I share grooming patterns is not for you to start accusing everybody of sexual abuse, because a lot of those things people do inadvertently, or they even consider it normal behavior, but they're not perpetrating. The reason why it's so important to understand grooming patterns is it should raise flags in your head if you see them, and you should respond to that. So we recommend what we call confronting with kindness. So I'm going to pick on my wife here and give you an example of confronting with kindness. So if you see someone that's using some of these patterns and you're not comfortable with it, pull that individual aside and explain the boundaries you have for your child and why you have them. That you're doing that to help protect them from sexual abuse. If the individual did the behavior innocently, they are likely going to be very apologetic and be very supportive of your boundaries. If the person is a perpetrator, they are very likely to move on. Not that we want them abusing one moving on to another child, not that we want them to abuse them, but if you can stop them from abusing your child, that's one less child that they have abused. So again, that's based on if they have feel there is any risk of them being caught, they'll almost always move on. So that's very, very important.
Do you have numbers? Is there any idea? Does it matter age? Is there more of this happens with certain ages than others?
I don't have the stats off the top of my head or with me the exact stats, but it's that later childhood age. I don't remember the exact range, but it's that 6 to 11 range. I know it's somewhere in there that's the most common, but I'd have to go look at the research to give you the exact, but I know it's somewhere in there. Yep.
I'm imagining myself approaching somebody, and I think, am I giving them ideas?
Yeah.
Or like by mentioning sexual abuse,
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that kid, sexual abuse.
Yeah. No. Perpetrators are usually so far down the path that discussing it's not gonna. That's not what's going to lead them to it. So people that perpetrate are sick in one of two ways. There's others, but the two biggies are they've either got sexual addictions or they've got control addictions, meaning they get a high out of controlling other people. Those are the two major drivers behind perpetrators. So let me share this example. So my son, I told you about at the beginning, I think he was it was right before he turned 17 or he had just turned 17, had a friend of his, the friend's mother called my son and said, hey, will you come over? I want to have a private discussion with you. What do you, yeah, I know, you guys are all going, right? And so did Christy, right? So knowing grooming patterns, the flags immediately went up, right? So she confronted with kindness. So she called the mom and said, hey, help me understand why you're inviting my son over. I'm not really comfortable with this. This is why I'm not comfortable with it. The woman was extremely apologetic. The reasons why she wanted to talk to my son is my son was good friends with her daughter, and her daughter was dealing with some mental health issues, and he had been a support to her in those issues, and she wanted to talk to him about it. She was extremely apologetic, said, hey, she totally got that was awkward, not right, not a good thing to do, right? And she responded by saying, can I come over to your house? Can I talk to him on the phone instead? A good example of my wife confronting with kindness when those flags went up. She didn't go in there saying, you're going to abuse my child, you're this, you're that, right? And she confronted with kindness. All right, let's go to the factors that increase risk. There's six big ones. The first is, and why we talk about healthy sexuality, is lack of information about healthy sexuality is one of the biggest things that increases risk. Because they don't know how to process if someone is trying to perpetrate, or they may get themselves in a situation, particularly teens, that they don't know is even risky because they don't know enough information. Or even worse, they've gotten their information from the playground, from the neighbor, from whatever, some other source that was inaccurate. A lot of times we want to shield our children, but sometimes that silence actually puts them more in harm than having good, healthy discussions with them. The second one is children with unsupervised access to tech are at higher risk. Remember the grooming patterns, how they test or they communicate secretly? That's why. Offenders will often target electronically before they will in person. Children who are insecure or struggle with self-esteem are more vulnerable because perpetrators thrive. Remember that gift giving, that attention. They thrive on children who struggle with self-worth because they feel like they can provide that and earn that trust. Children with special needs or disabilities are at higher risk. Perpetrators often view them as easier targets, particularly because they struggle with communication. So again, driven to that secrecy. Kids with disabilities are 3 times more likely to be victims of sexual abuse. For kids with intellectual and mental health disabilities, that number increases to 4.5 times. Children exposed to sexually explicit material are high at risk. Videos, music, television, innuendo, you name it, right? It just desensitizes them to the topic of sexuality. And children who are left unsupervised with teens and adults are at higher risk. So think single-parent homes, think homes where both parents work, where there's a lot of other care given to the children. Individuals in those circumstances need to take a little extra care. Think about leaving them alone with coaches or instructors, teachers, babysitters, all those increase risk. So our tools that minimize risk, and I'm going to go really fast through these because we need to get on to one other topic. So first and most important is your discernment. And this is where I'm glad we have the gospel of Christ and understand the principle of discernment. There's nothing, in my opinion, more powerful than our ability as parents to discern that something's not right. So ask yourself the questions. Does something seem odd? Is there a reason I feel uncomfortable? And if you're feeling those feelings, please act on it. Next is letting your child show affection on their terms. You want to teach them to own their sexuality. So even though we do it innocently, sometimes when we say, hey, go give your uncle a kiss, what we're teaching that child is you have to give your affection on someone else's terms. So instead it's, would you like to give your uncle a hug? Let them choose, right? And be okay if they choose not to. Don't force them to show affection. Allowing your kids to say no when they feel uncomfortable with something. And teach them to say that no loudly. Give them a voice, but remember, it's not the child's responsibility to correct. It's a parent's responsibility to correct an unhealthy situation. But we can empower our kids to say no. Have the age-appropriate ongoing conversations with our kids, and this I'm going to hit on in just a minute. Appropriate names for our bodies so that children can give voice to what they're experiencing. There's movements out there that say you have to use clinical terms. We don't feel that strongly. We feel it's important, similar to what it says in the Parent's Guide, that you need to use respectful terms. So whether you use the term buttocks or bottom, they're both respectful. They're both just fine. Just don't use slang terms to describe body parts. Give them the ability to describe their body parts. The goal is to enhance communication. Let's talk about safe touch. This is a pendulum metaphor where sometimes people are so worried about keeping touch safe that they don't give their kids enough appropriate, healthy touch. So kids, to develop properly, they need affection, especially in those youngest years. We just need to teach them that safe touch leaves them feeling happy and comfortable. Unsafe touch leaves them feeling uneasy or uncomfortable, and we need to help them distinguish the difference. And if they are feeling uncomfortable, they need to talk to us about it. And then the obvious, the private areas of our body are always unsafe touch, other than your youngest children when you're cleaning and so forth. The next one is secrets and safety. This is another one where there's a lot of public opinions on there that you don't have secrets in your home. And the reality is it's more important to teach the children what's an appropriate secret or surprise, if that's the term you prefer, and what's an inappropriate one. Because the reality is if your perpetrator's in that circle of trust, they're going to know what term you use. Changing the terminology isn't going to keep them safer. Helping them understand that safe secrets, again, help them feel good, like surprising someone for a party. Unsafe secrets are when they feel threatened or they feel uneasy or uncomfortable. So we got to teach them the difference. We need to monitor our children's digital interactions, and I won't go into great detail there. Let's talk about outings. Know the adult in charge. Open door policy. You should be able to walk in anytime, know who comes in and out of the home. And then finally, clear and safe boundaries. We want to set boundaries around things like family privacy, that it's private when you change, that our body parts are private. So the hope is that as we use all these tools, we're opening up communication with our children. And the other thing that we can really do that I'll close on are these age-appropriate conversations. And this is where the Parent's Guide will be extremely helpful because it gives you some pretty detailed examples of appropriate conversations at different ages. So it's pretty common for children between infancy and 2 to start discovering their genitals. They may explore it during diaper changes, things like that. For example, my 18-month-old daughter immediately puts her hand down there right now. A Parent's Guide says be neutral on that. Don't reinforce it, but also don't correct it at that age. They're just coming to know their body and understand their body like an arm or a hand. Just stay neutral. Later on, if they're still doing it, that's when correction needs to come in. But in those early years, just remain neutral to it. Understand that if they have a physical response, like an erection, for example, to touching themselves, that's not a sexual response. It's a normal biological response. Don't be overly alarmed by it in those early years. They love healthy touch. They love to be cuddled at this age. It's really important for them. So parents should consider the following. This is where you, especially as they get closer to 2, start teaching them appropriate names for body parts. We want to be careful that we don't initiate any type of shame. So that's why if they touch a body part, you don't use harsh correction at that age because that will engender shame about their body or their experience. Closer to 2, we want to start helping to differentiate gender. And that's really, really important. And we want to affirm the child's desire to experience appropriate touch like cuddling. Early childhood, 2 to 5, they begin to have a really clear sense of their own gender. They become curious about others' bodies, both children and adults. They want to understand them. They may have a heightened interest around their genitals, especially because they are covered by clothing and they start to notice that they're covered by clothing. So they may talk about it, they may giggle about the names, things like that. This is the age where it's fairly common for children to engage in doctor or house play. This is more based on curiosity than it is sexual drive. What you want to be wary of is if they're doing something that is inappropriate for their age. For example, it would be common at that age to do that, I'll show you mine if you show me yours. You want to correct that and help them understand boundaries and privacy. But if they're doing something extreme like oral sex, they've been exposed to something. They've been exposed to either images of it or they're being abused. That's not normal play at that age. So understand the difference and understand what the warning signs are for extreme behaviors. They may ask where babies come from at this age. That's pretty common. Teach children that nudity is not to be engaged in public and that genitals are private. That's pretty straightforward. Continue to teach appropriate names. You want to, if they're being curious about their bodies, ask them a lot of questions about what their experience. Don't use harsh correction at this age. They're still learning, but do use correction. And I hope you understand the difference. And a Parent's Guide does a really good job distinguishing the difference between the two at this age. So if asked where babies come from, give them a very basic description such as babies grow in a woman's body and it requires a man and a woman to create a baby. That's sufficient at this age. You don't necessarily need to go into deeper detail. Teach concepts of healthy touch and unhealthy touch. Okay, 6 to 8. Socialization starts to be really influenced by gender. This is where boys and girls often start separating. Learning about sexuality via friends and media is very possible at this age. They definitely have increased body awareness and privacy. awareness of sexual orientation may also start at this age. They would notice if two men were walking down the street holding hands. So understanding that will help you appropriately address topics like that. They're going to notice things, but when they do notice things like that, they don't make the connection between how a homosexual couple has their version of sex versus a man and a woman. So you don't need to go into those type of details, but you need to acknowledge that they're seeing different examples of relationships. So parents should educate regarding basic reproduction at this age, similar to what the Ayers said. Explain different sexual orientations, and like the church emphasizes, we want to emphasize respect, even though we adhere closely to our belief that marriage is only to be between a man and a woman. We want to reinforce and expand knowledge of rights, that no one has a right to their body. So this is where things often get distorted by some groups out there that they use that to talk about rights of body as it relates to things like abortion. That's not what we're interested in here when we talk about rights. We're saying that no one else has a right. No one should force you to hug. No one should force you to kiss, things like that. All right. Due to the interest of time, I'm going to conclude with this one, and that is age 9 to 12. There are other great things for our teens, but I'll refer you to Parents' Guide for those. Understand that puberty and physical changes begin on average for girls between 10 and 11 and boys 11 to 12. With puberty comes heightened sexuality. They may masturbate. That's something you want to correct. Masturbation, though it's taught by some as normal and natural, it is not normal and natural in the sense of that it cannot be controlled. We can absolutely manage those urges and impulses. Crushes begin to include more adult-like attractions, and awareness of their own sexual orientation may begin, so you need to be sensitive to that, particularly if they're feeling any feelings of same-gender attraction. This is where they also gain interest in sexual media like pornography. At this point, you want to really work hard to support healthy body image, because healthy body image can become a big issue at this age. And we want to discuss the roles of drugs and alcohol in sexual exploitation, as they may get introduced to that at this age. And we want to educate regarding physical and psychological aspects of puberty. For example, it is very normal, and you can read more about this in Parents' Guide, for boys to have what are called nocturnal emissions, or more commonly known as wet dreams. If a boy doesn't understand that that's normal, they may think it's masturbation. It is not. So I'll give you one example. As a stake president, I had at least 2 missionaries that came in to me telling me they had struggles with masturbation. When I dug, they were describing their wet dreams through their teenage years. So they had been living through those years with this guilt that they had been masturbating, thinking that they had done something wrong, and were very, very guilty about it. And their parents hadn't talked about it, their bishops hadn't caught it. We need to talk, that particular one, we need to talk about with boys so that they distinguish the difference. All right, let me skip forward to just what I want to close with. So I'm going to just show you this video really quick one more time. And I hope you see the signs differently this time, based on what we talked about. So each of those individuals gave their commitment to defend innocence of children. That's my ask of you today. Pick one thing. We went through a bunch of content. There's a million other things we could have hit on as well. But just pick one from today that you will commit to act on. And go commit and act on it and then share it. Share it in social media, share it with your co-ops, whatever is appropriate place, share it. And I appreciate the opportunity to share this presentation with you and hope that we together can defend the innocence of our children. Thanks.